Alright, so to get a bit of a head start on the horror theme we like to do throughout October, I figured I would go ahead and get started on the Tremors franchise and kind of stretch them out one movie at a time throughout the next weeks until we get to the end of October. And one of the reasons that I kind of wanted to do this was the fun part about this, I'm hoping, is that I am very familiar with the first movie, and I've seen it a handful of times. But up until this point, I have never seen any of the sequels, like up to now. So what I am planning on doing is kind of watching them one at a time, like we're doing the videos, and then like as soon as I watch the second one, then I'll immediately talk about it on it, so they're like as fresh as possible. Because I honestly have no idea what directions the sequels go in at all. The first one is the only one I've seen as of this moment. So I'll be discovering those as we go along. But in the meantime, I do want to start with the first one, which obviously seems kind of has that sort of cheesy monster movie vibe, despite being made in 1990 or being released in 1990. And it kind of apparently had that vibe going into it as well, where I guess Kevin Bacon was really bent out of shape and thinking his career was going down the drain because he was making a sandworm movie essentially. That's something you would see in like the B sci-fi 50s area. But then ultimately later in life, he would call it the most fun experience he's ever had making a movie. Still to this day. And that's something that's really apparent when you watch a movie like this, and it's clear to see why a movie like this would take off and how it still actually is as good as it's ever been today. Because I think there is something a bit timeless about the way it takes the approach of the monster movie. Because when we see the way those movies are typically set up, where we kind of meet the community of characters first, we spend some time on that, and they're going to be the ones that are ultimately in peril throughout this whole thing. And yeah, that's a really good start. It's just kind of introducing the fun characters, specifically our two main characters with the handyman played by Bacon and Fred Ward. And there's just something so immediate about what's going on between Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward here, where we have like this immediate sense that they've known each other for a really long time, and we see all their little games with each other, all the whole rock paper scissors thing. We already get the vibe that that's been a running joke with them for probably years, and it continues to be a running joke throughout the movie. And there's a ton of that between these characters, and the way they bring that to life is really great also. And then meeting the likes of the Gummers with Michael Gross and Reba McEntire. Michael Gross, who that's like the only thing I know about the sequels is that Michael Gross is like the sort of through line for all of them. Where he was meant to be like this sort of Eastwood or Chuck Norris type or something in the writing process. And just setting up this whole community before we get a very Jaws-like start, where one of the characters is stalked through point of view shots. And it does feel like there's quite a bit of Jaws influence in here, not just like the climax sort of has that vibe, the way they try to find the different ways to trick them and trap them and blow them up. There's also a severed head reveal in this that feels very akin to the severed head reveal in Jaws, one of the most famous scenes. Um, but what's interesting about the point of view shots is, to my understanding, they were kind of a last minute idea, and they were kind of pressured on the director Ron Underwood, because they initially wanted to set up this whole vibe of making the audience think it's a human killer at first. I kind of talked about this when we talked about the original Child's Play, and how I like the fact that when we saw the point of view shots of Chucky, they were at just a level enough to where, like, if you didn't know the concept going in, you could potentially think the killer was like Andy. And I guess they were going for a similar vibe in this. But I think it was the studio or the higher ups in some way didn't like the idea and wanted the audience to know immediately they were getting a monster movie. Which here was probably the better call, because, like I was talking about, you can embrace that whole B monster movie vibe all the way through, which I think really helps a movie like this and really helps it find its charm really quickly and what's going to make it work. Like, even when we see the gore after people have been killed, it feels just very sort of like a low budget movie from another era, but in a really charming and effective way. Like I said, like something you would have seen in the 50s. I even experimented. There's another movie I did this with to great success, I thought, where some people like to, because there are some movies where it's a whole color grading thing, where it's much more elaborate to do that officially. Taking a color movie and making it black and white for a better effect. But you can also accomplish this somewhat by just turning the color down on your TV, which is sometimes fun to experiment with. And I found that the movie It's Alive very, very much suits that. Like, the movie It's Alive is so much better when you just turn the color off of your TV and it looks black and white and older than how it actually looks. And I experimented with this in the same way. And while you can kind of take or leave it, it's fun to experiment and see what this would look like as a movie from the era that it seems to be sort of evoking. So that's a lot of fun to do. Obviously, if there's one thing that might take away from that, it would be Kevin Bacon screaming "fuck you" in one of the most memorable uses of "fuck you" in probably any movie. And it is to my understanding there was actually it originally had an R rating, but the R rating had nothing to do with the gore. It was all about the language. Like, there was a lot more fucks used in it. But I like the fact that we just get the one drawn out "fuck you" is much more effective. And like later on, when Michael Gross is saying stuff like "mother humbers," it's like there's some sort of charm to that. Like, it almost feels like it completely suits the character for him to say "mother humbers" and for Bacon to latch onto that. So all these things that are like these changes that are kind of happening last minute that they didn't initially intend are, interestingly enough, making the movie seemingly better and more charming and really finding its footing as like a true monster movie, which is really fun. And of course, if you're going to talk about monster movies and how successful they are, obviously something I don't know yet how much the sequels may or may not drop the ball on this, but just in case, I was basking in it as much as I could. The use of practical effects in this is amazing. We were talking about whether it be the gore or the worms themselves, and whenever they appear. And I like how there's a little bit of time before we get like a really, really good look, like when they start splitting up into other worms. And there's that whole idea of every new time we see them, we're not sure what they're going to look like. Like a different part of them is revealed every time they're shown throughout the movie. Which is great. And just the whole idea of seeing them like right there with the actors. There's that one scene in the basement where the worm coming through the wall and Michael Gross shooting all in the same shot appeared to be two shots that were meshed together. But apart from that, everything looks like it's just there, like actually physically there, and that adds so much. And talking about the community of characters and of things actually being there, and like animatronics and stuff actually being there. I keep forgetting that Ariana Richards is in this as a little girl, and it's like this was 3 years prior to Jurassic Park when she would still be pursued by deadly creatures. Is just very funny, and the fact that this came first is even funnier. What's interesting about it also is just the concept in general and the way they set up how like the whole idea of being stranded and how that's scary in itself. But when you're stranded because there's something trying to kill you, apparently the writer got the idea from he was out working in the desert and he was on a rock, and it just kind of suddenly occurred to him, like, what if I was trapped here and something had trapped me here? And yeah, that's a pretty terrifying concept to go on, and the way they set that up, like when we see the dude that's like been dead on the tower for a few days, and you just kind of quickly piece together that he was trying to avoid something, and that's why he would be up there for so long, and to add the monster factor on top of just that fear of being stranded as it is, adds a whole other thing here to the sort of horror element, because it is so over the top and seemingly intentionally cheesy and evoking that certain era that you may not immediately think to view it as like a horror movie, but I mean it really sets up scares pretty well, like as far as concept and imagine being trapped like these people are. Because one of the great things about this movie is the fact that almost all of it is outdoors. I think there's like 2 interior sets. There's the store and the basement. And to think the level of creativity that it would take to work on that, because all you have to work with on top of that is just vast desert with hardly anything around it. And that's when you can really start to tell the creativity that went into this in regards to the set pieces. and the sort of thrill element that they find in that. And the whole idea of, we were talking about the point of view shots. There's also some really great shots that they get, like, where they're showing the action without showing the action, where it's Nestor, the poor guy in the tire that gets pulled through. And when he starts getting pulled under the ground, how we can hear his screaming sort of moving, and the camera follows not from underneath but on the surface, and it's like still the same effect, even though it's a significantly easier shot and a less effects heavy shot, and it's stuff like that. Like combining that with the use of practical effects and the not feeling like you have to show everything, is a very winning combination that we saw in stuff like Jaws, and to a lesser degree Jurassic Park. A lot of Jurassic Park is on screen, of course, but it's still there also. And the whole idea of that, finding that safety zone, like even if you feel stranded, still having like that one safety zone. Like the car scene always reminds me of Cujo, when the woman's inside and after her husband's been pulled under, and it's like, well, she's in the car and she's stranded now, but at least she's safe in the car. And then the car itself starts to get pulled under. And then the way we see this escalate throughout the movie, where eventually the thrill of seeing this car get entirely pulled under eventually turns into the thrill of seeing an entire building start to get pulled and start to collapse. Like I said, all the practical stuff here, not just in the worms themselves, but the destruction the worms cause. The practical effects really play a big part in adding to the thrill element of that, which is great. And what else are we looking at? There is, as far as like the other characters, what I was saying about the community is that I do, while the individual characters may not necessarily be like really fleshed out or anything, like I said, it's really the community of them that makes it work. And like I said, it gives you this vibe of the class movies, like when they're in the store, and you have almost this like survival element to it. And the fact that not many of the major characters in this community die, is actually quite refreshing, despite the fact that the threat is constantly known and you actually feel the threat constantly. But without there having to be an overabundance of like kill scenes, because then after a while that would have been all it became. But when it seems to be more about like the survival element and having to do different things to stop the worms and different ways to avoid them, and these different little locations to get stranded on, is where the movie's creativity kicks in, and like that almost gives it like this fresh feel and a much more, almost like it's a lot smarter than you might give a movie like this credit for. And you start to, instead of waiting for the next kills, you wait for the scenes where they figure out the next thing they can do, like the whole fishing thing. And then when you get to see the way that goes south, and then that the suspenses come back full circle, and then you have to wait to see what the next idea is going to be instead of what the next kill is. And that's the kind of stuff that I feel like keeps audiences really, really gripped. Whereas just kind of watching kills over and over again would only go so far. And I feel like that's a place that this movie really succeeds. So, and then getting to the big climatic moment, when he manages to trick the worm to digging itself into a cliff and just splattering, is so satisfying in this way that feels incredibly big budget, while also feeling like the cheesy B movie that's at its heart. And that's just like that kind of stuff really goes a long way, and you actually love even though you may not necessarily get to know the characters personally, a lot of the side characters, like I said, just the community aspect, you kind of love the fact that most of them survive, and you're happy that most of them survive, and they outsmart the worms and ultimately beat them. Even useless ass Melvin, I think his name is. He's just like it's all just one thing, just one unit. The characters are, and it's yeah. So, and then obviously they kind of shoehorn in the whole idea of, people ending up together and stuff like that, which, one could take or leave, and it's not extremely necessary, but it's nice. Apparently there was an original ending that was a bit more somewhat, but not really ambiguous about that, which, either way. But as far as the character work in general, I do think that there wasn't going to be a character that had as good of chemistry with Kevin Bacon as Fred Ward did. So like that was the real that was the real couple of the movie, I guess you could say. and all of that. So yeah, so I think that's why Tremors works so well, and why it apparently spawned this seemingly endless franchise. So we're gonna get into those. Like I said, I will go into the second movie blind, and then we'll talk about it next and see where we are, and then see what's down that path. And in between those, obviously, we'll keep doing the same stuff, the verses and the stuff like that. And as we get into October, we'll have much more of the horror theme and stuff like that. A lot of Stephen King will be coming back because he's always here in October. But a bunch of other stuff as well. We'll be talking about some Carpenter. Argento is going to be in there. It'll be interesting. We'll be revisiting some stuff that's kind of gotten cult following since the last time I saw them when they first came out. That should be interesting. And like I was saying, we've got a trilogy at the end, and then a quadrilogy as well. So we're doing the franchise thing both apart and together for different ones. So we'll see what comes with all that. But until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.